أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول أشهد أن محمد.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. We're back for another episode of Islam in Focus. We're continuing with our series dealing with the sources of Islam. Today we have our second segment dealing with the topic of the Quran in modern sciences. I have joining me on the program as usual, Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
We began with the first segment of this very interesting topic last week. I wonder if perhaps I could have you very quickly summarize the main points that we touched on in that program.
Sure. We started first from what you might call a methodological question that some people might raise about the appropriateness of comparing science with scriptures or with holy books. And we discussed the reasons why some people may have reservations on that. I discussed some of those reservations, and we tried to conclude that if some precautions are taken, there's nothing wrong with doing that, and we refer to the Quran to certain citations that encourages us, in fact, to investigate and increase our knowledge. And we started by looking into some comparative aspects that has been discussed by Dr. Bouquet in the book The Bible, the Quran, and Science. And we analyzed two of the areas that he discussed, like the story of creation and the date of the first human to emerge on Earth. And we said that the basic conclusion that is quite evident throughout his book is that only in the case of the Quran do we fail to find a single statement which are incompatible with established sciences.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, turning to another comparative issue between the Bible and the Quran, and that is with respect to the flood, the story of Noah in the flood. How is the account of the flood given in the Bible, first of all?
Well, as far as the biblical version, it basically says that there was a big corruption and infraction during the time of Prophet Noah, that not too many people believed in him or followed him, and then God decided to punish the people on earth, and there was a general or universal flood that destroyed everything on earth. In fact, according to Genesis 6:17, it says, "And behold, even I do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under the heaven, and everything that is on the earth shall die." So the Bible is quite clear that it was universal flood that destroyed the entire life on earth, except of course for Noah and his household in the ark. Now, beside this universality of the flood as depicted in the Bible, the date of the flood is quite interesting. According to the calculation made by Dr. Bouquet on the basis of the information given in the Bible, the flood should have taken place about 292 years before Abraham, Prophet Abraham. He went on to calculate, of course, the time when Noah was born, that he was born a certain number of years, that's exactly 1056 years after Adam, and then the flood happened when Noah was 600 years old, so the total here is 1656 years minus the period from Adam to Abraham, which is 1948, and that gives us 292 years, that is before Abraham. And based on the previous calculation, that is from Abraham to Jesus, you add another 1800 years. From Jesus, peace be upon him, to today, there is another 2000 years. It means then that the flood, according to the Bible, must have taken place somewhere between the 21st and 22nd centuries before Jesus, peace be upon him. Now, to say that the flood happened about 4,100 or 4,200 years ago is something that is rather incompatible again with findings from archaeology and other sources, because it is known that during that period many civilizations or remains from various civilizations showed that these civilizations continued to exist without interruption. For example, this period coincides with the period immediately before the 11th dynasty in Egypt, and coincides with the 3rd dynasty in Babylon at Ur. So in that sense it's impossible that life was destroyed totally from the entire earth at that time, as we find in Genesis 6, for example. The other observation that Dr. Bouquet referred to is that it says that when Abraham came, he found that humanity was able to regroup again and live in separate communities. Now, according to the Bible, nobody was saved from that flood except Prophet Abraham, his 3 sons, and their wives, and the animals, of course, that he took on the ark. Prophet Noah. Yes. That's right. Now, that means then that the whole humanity, if the whole humanity was destroyed, started again with this 4 people, Noah and his sons and their wives. Okay? Now, what Bouquet is saying is that it is impossible that in 292 years this very small family could have multiplied to such an extent that they were divided and living in so many different parts of the world and under different civilizations. So these are some of the difficulties that he raises with respect to the story of the flood, the way it's presented, at least in Genesis.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to turn now to examination then of the Quranic version. Mm-hmm. How does it differ? And
how does it compare?
Yes, compared to the biblical.
Well, first of all, the Quran doesn't give any date of the flood. So all this problem of chronology, like the previous issue that we discussed before about, the first man on earth, does not exist at all in the Quran. The other thing is that the Quran also indicates that there were more than Noah and his sons. In fact, in the 11th surah in the Quran, in verse 42, it indicates that one of the sons of Noah did not even actually come with him on the ark, and he was drowned with the other unbelievers. In addition, in the same surah also, 11, in verse 40, it indicates that there were other believers also, other than the household of Noah, who came with him on the ark. Yes, they were few, but they were still people outside of his immediate family. But perhaps the most important point from the scientific standpoint is that the Quran does not say that the flood was universal. In fact, there is a clear indication in the Quran that it was only the people of Noah that were destroyed. For example, in Surah 25, from verse 35 on, it says, وَقَوْمَ نُوحٍ لَمَّا كَذَّبُوا الرُّسُلَ أَغْرَقْنَاهُمْ. And it says, and the people of Noah, when they rejected the messengers, that means Noah, we drowned them, or we caused them to drown, which indicate that it was a localized type of flood, but not necessarily a universal one. And in that sense, not only does he conclude that the Quran is or the scientific discoveries are totally compatible with the Quran in that respect, that there was no universal flood, but he says that an interesting remark is that the only source about the story of the flood prior to the revelation of the Quran was the Bible itself. And for those who say that the Quran adapted or copied from the Bible, how could it happen if this was the only source? You can't say, for example, the Prophet took a little bit from the Bible and a little bit from somewhere else. The only document available about the flood was the Bible. However, the Quran is different, and actually, you might say, make correction to the statements made hundreds of years before its revelation, and hundreds of years before anyone could really discover that from the scientific standpoint, it could have not been a universal flood.
Well, now, in our first program in the segment, you included the Exodus as one of the areas that had been analyzed by Dr. Bouquet. Can you share with us his findings on that subject?
Okay, the issue of the Exodus is a little different from the first three issues. And actually what Bouquet is saying here is that if you really look at both the Bible and the Quran, you will find that studying them together may provide some kind of complementarity in having answers to very interesting questions about what happened in the Exodus. He doesn't say, however, that they are identical. In fact, there are differences here and there. There's no question about it. But he found that, by and large, the story of the flood in the Bible, the story of the Exodus in the Bible, is fairly justified or fairly compatible, if you will, with discoveries. Not necessarily everything, but fairly compatible. And the point that he wanted to add here as reflecting the importance of studying the Quran here is that there are certain informations given in the Quran which does not appear in the Bible about Exodus, which seem to shed light about some of the interesting questions that has been puzzling to many historians.
Well, can you give us an example of such information?
Okay. There's at least one basic area which is paramount in its importance. To start with, many historians have been raising questions as to who exactly was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. What's his name, what dynasty did he belong to? This is one thing. And if you take the Quran and the Bible, you find at least there is one thing that's common. That is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the one who pursued Moses and the Israelites, was drowned, he and his army. However, as far as the Bible is concerned, there is absolutely no mention as to what happened to his body after he drowned. I mean, just silent on it. There's no mention of it. And the implication actually in the Bible that he just perished in the sea, he and his soldiers. Now, Dr. Bouquet made a reference to an interesting passage in the Quran in Surah number 10. That's from verse 90 on, which says, فَالْيَوْمَ نُنَجِّيكَ بِبَدَنِكَ لِتَكُونَ لِمَنْ خَلْفَكَ آيَةً. That is talking about the Exodus and saying that after the Pharaoh was drowned, it says, today or this day we save you in your body, so that you may be a sign for those who come after you. But verily, many among mankind are heedless of our signs. That's a clear reference in the Quran that the body of the king or the Pharaoh of the Exodus was actually recovered after he drowned. Now, Dr. Bouquet goes on discuss in some detail. In fact, he's quite interested in that subject because he did some original research on it. And he said that from the historical standpoint, even though some people believe that the Pharaoh of the Exodus possibly could have been Ramses II, he concludes that in all likelihood, the Ramses II, who was the Pharaoh who persecuted the Israelites before Moses took refuge in Midian, actually died during the stay of Prophet Moses in Midian. His successor, who was also his son, Merneptah, actually is believed to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the one who pursued Moses. Now, the interesting thing is that it was only in 1998, so we're talking here about the very end of
1898.
1898. Yes. So we're talking about the very end of the 19th century.
Yes.
The mummified body of Merneptah, that Pharaoh, was discovered in the King's Valley in Thebes in Egypt. And in 1907, the wrappings of the mummy were removed by a scholar by the name of Elliot Smith, who wrote actually a book about it called The Royal Mummies, published in 1912. And it was not until 1975, imagine, 1975, that the author of that book, Dr. Bouquet, persuaded the Egyptian government to allow him to medically examine the mummy, the mummified body of Merneptah. And the various investigations that he did, he with the help of some other doctors, were really quite interesting in shedding light on that particular historical aspect of the Exodus.
Well, could you perhaps highlight the results of that analysis and indicate how they relate to what the Quran says about the Exodus?
Well, he called on the help of a number of specialist doctors, and they did what he calls an excellent radiographic study of the mummy. And in addition to this, he was able also to examine the interior of the thorax and abdomen, or the inside of the body, using a very sophisticated method. They call it endoscopy, to look inside and find out what's going on. And he says actually this was the first example or first case of the using of the medical technique, or this endoscopy, to examine a mummy. It has been used on humans, but on a mummy that was the first time to use it. With these and other studies, he came to the conclusion that this mummified body of Merneptah, which believed to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, most probably died either from drowning or from a very violent shock which preceded the moment of drowning, or both. And he concludes, and I quote him on that, he says, "Those who seek among modern data for proof of the veracity of the Holy Scriptures," referring to the Quran, "will find a magnificent illustration of the verses of the Quran dealing with the Pharaoh's body by visiting the royal mummy's room in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo." What he refers to here is the verse that I cited earlier, that as the Quran said, "Today we are going to save you in your body so that you may be a sign for those after you." I humbly understand that also to be a sign that this Quran could have never come from a human source. To discover this in 1975, and to discover the mummy even in 1998 for the first time, and nobody knew about its existence. 1898.
Yes.
Yeah, but nobody had any notion about it, at least in the days of the Prophet, and for centuries even before him, nobody had any notion until it was discovered again.
Yes.
Is something really amazing, and like I said again, raises the basic question: is it conceivable that the Quran borrowed from any other source? Is it conceivable that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was 1400 years ahead of his time in terms of science, and made that reference at the time when nobody could even thought or conceived of it? And finally, is it possible that the Quran could have had any other source other than divine source, divine revelation?
Shocking. Let's move on now to what the Quran says about the creation of the universe. Before doing that, however, I'd like to put the discussion into some kind of a perspective. How does our planet fit into the universe?
Well, like a drop in an ocean, to put it really in a nutshell. Like a drop in an ocean. Just to put it very briefly, you see, our Earth and the planets rotate around, the various planets in the solar system rotate around the star of that system, which is the Sun. Now, of course, many of the viewers must have heard about the moon shuttle and people who landed on the moon and so on. And that's a very minute distance. You're talking here about a distance between the Earth and Moon in the neighborhood of about 240,000 miles. Now, the distance between the Earth and the Sun, on the other hand, is much, much more. 93 million miles. Now, that might sound like too much. Okay, wait until you see the remaining. Between the Earth and Pluto, which is the farthest planet in the solar system, the distance actually is 3,672,000,000 miles, which means that the light of the sun takes about 6 hours to reach from the sun to Pluto at the horrifying speed of 186,000 miles per second. Again, you might think that that's just too much. That's, again, a drop in another big ocean, because the entire solar system is actually a small part of our galaxy, the Milky Way. And in our galaxy, you're talking really about what the scientists estimate to be 100 billion, with the B, 100 billion stars. Again, you might think that these galaxies are just stunning. All right. About 55 years ago or so, it was discovered that the Milky Way, or our own galaxy, is not the only galaxy in the universe, but there are also other giant galaxies, again with hundreds of billions of stars, some of which of course are billions of times the size of various planets like our Earth. Now, just to appreciate this vastness, scientists tell us that it takes sometimes billions of years, by the B, billions of light years, at the speed of 186,000 miles per second, for the light of the farthest star that we know of, or we can think of, in the confines of the known universe to reach our Earth. That's just dazzling, because it means that sometimes you would be looking at stars which were dead for billions of years, but you're looking simply at the light just reaching us now after billions of light years at that horrifying speed. So again, to come back to the initial statement, our Earth, not even a drop in an ocean.
Well, how did these galaxies that you've been speaking of, how did they come into existence in the first place?
Well, the most firm position taken by scientists, as Dr. Bouquet mentioned, is that, to start with, it's very difficult, of course, to say that we are able to determine by year and month and so on the exact date when the universe was created. I mean, beyond certain limit, it's just impossible to speak about it. But there is a growing evidence, however, that the universe in the beginning was a gaseous mass, a big mass of gas, which was composed mainly of hydrogen and certain amount of helium, which was slowly rotating. Now, this kind of mass, or they call it also the nebula, was then split up into fragments. And these fragments are so huge that, for example, they estimate that some of those fragments that split from that nebula would be between 1 to 100 billion times the size of the sun. So you're really talking about something beyond imagination in terms of their size. And then they say these fragments were further split up, or separated again into what we know now as the stars. And the stars again are, like I said, just one element around which systems also are rotating.
What is it about the stars that make them shiny?
Well, according to scientists, they have a nice explanation for that. Let me try to give you some closer description of what they say. They say that over time there was a process of condensation, okay? And under these circumstances, gravitational forces, or gravity, came into play, coupled with the pressures and the influence of magnetic fields, radiation also. These stars started to contract and transform gravitational forces in what scientists call thermal energy. Okay? And they say this thermal energy basically is what explains the shyness, if you will, that we can observe in the stars. They also indicate that as a result of thermonuclear reactions, the transition also took place from hydrogen to helium, and then from helium to carbon and oxygen, and then from there to metals and metalloids. So it's basically this process that resulted in this sparks that we can observe in the stars.
What you've said so far is that in all likelihood the various planets and galaxies were originally a mass of gas.
That's right.
Did the Quran make any reference to this?
Yes, it does. In fact, there are two very interesting citations to that in the Quran. The one appears in Surah 21 in verse 30, which says in the meaning, أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. It translates that don't the unbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were all but one, or joined together, or fused together, and then we separated them or split them up. Notice the expression. The second related citation in the Quran appears in Surah 41 in verses 11 and 12. ثم استوى إلى السماء وهي دخان. It says that God then created or established the skies when they were smoke. The sky were smoke. Notice here the term smoke is a very close description that anyone can understand, of course, with any level of knowledge. For the simple Bedouin listening to that, he can understand what smoke means. For the scientist, however, the mention of smoke in the Quran is indeed very interesting, because as Dr. Bouquet said, he said, if you really look at the smoke, what is the smoke? It is generally made up of gaseous substratum, as the physicists call it, in more or less stable suspension, and then you have these fine particles, which may belong to solid and even liquid states of matters at very high or very low temperature. So, in other words, when you talk about smoke, you're really talking also about this notion of a gaseous mass. And the interesting question that should be raised really here is that how could Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, 1400 years ago, invent or adopt from any source that the universe, as modern science has discovered, was altogether was one part, and then it was split into these fragments, as we mentioned before, and the fragments were further split into stars and other planets. How could he have possibly or conceivably got this information from?
Very, very striking information, very startling. I think on that note we should conclude our program for today. We want to thank you for watching and invite you back next week when we'll continue with this very interesting discussion. Thank you for watching. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول